order. Is now resumed.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, panel members. I am advised I have 18 minutes left with you. So for me, I'm in the home stretch. I think you have a little bit more time ahead of you. I want to come back to the wild salmon policy and begin with you, Dr. Richards. I'm advised that there's a paper that Dr. Holtby of your science group has produced in conjunction with the wild salmon policy entitled A Synoptic Approach for Assessing the Conservation Status of Pacific Salmon on a Regional Basis. Is that correct?
I know Dr. Holtby has produced a number of papers, and I'm not sure that is specifically linked to the wild salmon policy. And depending on which paper, Dr. Holtby was very engaged in the techniques we use to identify conservation units. If that's
Yes.
If that's the paper that
And
you're
this is the one for regionalization and aggregation of conservation units on a regional basis, in which he examined specifically Fraser River sockeye salmon and Chinook salmon. Is that ringing a bell with you?
I didn't review that specific paper, but I know that he has been the main person in the science staff who has worked on identifying the conservation units. I also know that he was working more recently with Sue Grant and her colleagues, and his most recent analysis of the conservation units is included in the paper which we have already identified for these hearings.
The one question that I wanted to come back to in terms of the wild salmon policy as a general question was whether or not the wild salmon policy applies to aquaculture operations, finfish aquaculture operations in British Columbia. Can you address that, Associate Deputy Minister?
It's the wild salmon policy, so it didn't, I don't believe it was designed with that in mind. I turn it to Sue Funler to confirm that.
The wild salmon policy speaks to a number of things not directly addressed under harvest and habitat, under the ecosystem component of the policy, and so also under the habitat for the question of aquaculture. Now, at the time the policy was written, of course, we were not the primary regulators of aquaculture, but it is certainly considered with respect to the wild salmon policy in terms of whether we have put mitigative measures in place for either habitat or potential ecosystem impacts.
So you're describing that there is some linkage between aquaculture operations and the wild salmon policy in terms of ecosystem
as there would
approach.
be if in any activity that goes on in or around the habitat or the ecosystem for wild salmon. Yeah.
Could I go to conservation document number 29, please? What you should have before you is a website, the Minister's Message for Fisheries and Oceans report on plans and priorities 2011 to 2012. No doubt you recognize this, do you not, Deputy?
Yes.
Could this be marked as the next exhibit, please?
1941.
Could I now go to conservation document number 13, please? This question is for you, Associate Deputy Minister, and then to the Deputy Minister. This is a note about a meeting with Marine Harvest Canada that took place on March 30th, 2010 with the Minister, Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you summarize that meeting in the note that follows in your briefing to the Deputy Ministers. And that's a fair and accurate summary of what transpired at that meeting?
Yeah, yes it is.
So a concern was expressed by certainly Marine Harvest Canada, whom you know to be one of the major operators of finfish aquaculture in BC, about what was going to take place in terms of this particular inquiry. Is that fair to say?
Yes, they expressed concerns during the meeting.
Could we have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
1942.
Now, the next question is to you, Deputy. Did you also meet with representatives from Marine Harvest Canada at this time, or were you simply in the loop by virtue of your Associate Deputy Minister's note?
I was in the loop.
And I suppose the general question to you is, if you're trying to promote transparency so that decision-making is above board, why is it that the minister is meeting behind closed doors with members of industry like this?
The minister meets with, and this is very standard practice for ministers. Ministers are ministers for all Canadians, and they meet with any number of groups. They will have met with anyone, almost anyone, who will write to the minister and suggest a meeting, particularly people that we work with on a regular basis. So that is part of our transparency, and we can't have multi-stakeholder meetings at every meeting. It's important to sometimes hear from individual groups to hear what their concerns are.
Certainly, to your knowledge, Associate Deputy Minister, there wasn't such a meeting prior to the inception of the technical hearings in this inquiry with Anglo community or with First Nations communities, were there?
We met with Tides Canada on this issue. The minister met with Tides Canada.
Did the minister meet with any First Nations groups on this issue?
The minister has had meetings with First Nations. I can't, I wasn't involved directly in those, so I couldn't tell you what the subject matters were.
If I may, I can, and Sue will jump in, the minister has met with many First Nations groups over the years and does so regularly on any number of issues.
But the specific topic that was being discussed at this time was the position of the Department of Fishery and Oceans were to take with respect to these particular hearings. Is that fair to say? They
expressed their views, their concerns. They had information regarding what they're doing with respect to sea lice. They had also suggested some changes to siting of their farm locations, etc. So it was an information flow from them to the department. There was no suggestion that the department or the minister should adopt any particular position at these hearings, but rather that they were expressing their concerns that there could be some impacts on their companies, and they did look at trying to provide information to the department regarding what they're doing to manage sea lice and other such things.
There was an acknowledgement by MHC, Marine Harvest Canada, that they wanted to move their siting closer to the open sea to reduce potential environmental impacts and controversy, according to this note.
That's correct, yes.
Could we have number 19, please, and the conservation list? This also references a meeting with the BC Salmon Farmers Association back in, looks like October 27th of 2003. I'm not sure if any of you were around then. The deputy is shaking her head no, with a look of gratitude, I can imagine. Ms. Farlinger, you're aware of this, right? Because I think I saw your name on this briefing note at the end.
Yes.
And the concern being expressed in this particular meeting was the delay in getting approvals through the SIA process, was it not?
It appears to be that, yes, and that wouldn't surprise me that would be.
Could we have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 1943.
And finally, could we have conservation document number 16, please? This is another email exchange. I think if we go to PDF 2, I saw Mr. Bevan's name on it somewhere. And if I find your name here, Mr. Bevan, and then if we can scroll down, I'll give you the gist of what is actually happening. If we go to the original email, which is the email from Al Castledine from the province, and there's a reference to an announcement that's going to take place shortly after the date of the sending, and the announcement is one by Marine Harvest Canada and the Coastal Alliance for Aquaculture Reform about a framework for dialogue. Do you recall this issue?
Vaguely. Unfortunately, I don't recall a lot of the details on this issue.
Can we just scroll down just a couple of more paragraphs, please, Mr. Lunn? There's a reference here to the, in quotes, framework for dialogue, the culmination of a year and a half of discussion between the two parties. And a reference to it is to foster collaborative efforts towards solving challenges surrounding net cage salmon farming. If we can go to the next page, please. The framework promotes collaborative research on sea lice and exploration of the viability of closed tank systems, and establishing migratory corridors for wild salmon. And then as part of this, it appears as though Marine Harvest moved salmon from Glacier Falls site to the Midsummer Island site, a site more removed from what is considered by some to be a major migratory route for juvenile salmon. So that's something that Marine Harvest certainly was willing to engage in at that time. You were aware of that?
This is not with respect to the specific email chain, but certainly I was aware of the fact that Marine Harvest was concerned about the social license of their operations in terms of being socially acceptable and not being challenged. They were looking for ways to resolve that limit on their potential for growth. They couldn't, they weren't able to continue to expand as they would have wished to, because there was lots of pressure on the government of BC at the time to stop the expansion of the industry and to hold the number of sites constant. So they were looking for ways to deal with the concerns and to find a way to see if they could get the approvals to expand their operations.
Could we have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
1944?
And that leads me to my final area of questions, which is what we have been calling in this inquiry the grandfathering or the rolling over of the existing aquaculture licenses when the federal government took authority, legislative and regulatory authority, over aquaculture facilities. And I understand that that decision was made by the minister, and I further understand that we don't have a written decision note of that. Am I correct in that view?
Yeah, we're not, we've been working our way through the history of this, and I'm fairly sure that the decision was made by me, and it was made through a series of other meetings. We were having regular briefings with David and his staff and others on a weekly basis with me to walk through implementation, because as you know, I think you know, the time frame we were given to make the big regulatory change was very short, and we needed to make sure that that we not miss a beat basically as we move forward, and the decision was that we had no evidence on which to make it to not grandfather any of the licenses, and we knew that we would be spending a lot of time working to ensure that the conditions of license would be well established by us through consultation in the future, and that's where the greater part of the regulation would come in.
And the licenses, I understand, that were rolled over for a period of 1 year, which is probably going to be coming up fairly shortly. Can you advise me whether it's the intent of Canada to renew it for a further period of 1 year, or have you made that determination yet?
We're still working our way through this.
In terms of the consultations that you had, I assume that you had consultations with the industry representatives in terms of what you're going to do to their licenses. Is that fair to say?
We certainly had consultations through the regulatory phase
Yes.
as we were developing the reg and the conditions of license, and we had some consultation before that. In fact, we had quite an extensive consultation right around the province, which Sue can certainly speak to.
Right. I imagine that you would have had extensive consultations with the province, who was handing over authority to you, so that you would understand the regulatory framework under which they operate.
Certainly we did, yes. We worked very closely with them, yes.
And what about possible impact upon other stakeholders? Did you have consultations with commercial fishermen? Did you have consultations with First Nations? Did you have consultations with NGOs about this rollover?
There were a number of stages to the consultation. First of all, prior to the gazetting, I would say, Gazette 1, formal consultation process that occurs between the period of Gazette 1 and Gazette 2, which is a specific national process which has provides for citizen input or group input. And then specifically before the licenses were provided on December 18th. The conditions of the license were released to a variety of groups. They were reduced to the produced to the aquaculture industry. They were provided to First Nations, to individual First Nations, and there were presentations made during this period of consultation to other interested groups. One I can recall in particular was a presentation to the Sports Fish Advisory Board. There may have been a presentation to the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee or other commercial groups, but I would have to look back and see what those were. But the one I remember specifically was a presentation to the Sport Fish Advisory Board, as well as the release of the conditions of license and the format of license to First Nations.
Thank you, panel members. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. It is now approximately 20 minutes after 10. I have been provided with 1 hour in cross-examination. Let me commence by making this observation, having sat in this hearing room for 10 months hearing evidence, that I do very much respect what I consider an overwhelming responsibility that all four of you have in trying to discharge your responsibilities, your statutory responsibilities to the citizens of Canada. It really is overwhelming to see what rests on your shoulders. And I compliment you for your courage. However, that really ends my compliments in respect to where I go with this cross-examination. I have responsibilities, and I should indicate that, as all of you know, that I represent Area D, Gillnet, and Area B, Sainer. I have a responsibility to my clients to bring to this commission a reality check in respect to your perception of whether or not you are discharging your responsibilities in terms of the statutes to a degree that the citizens of Canada should feel comfortable that this very valuable resource is being properly managed. All of my cross-examination is in the context of that reality check. I first want to deal with budget issues, and we heard your evidence in respect to budget issues both last year, Ms. Dansereau, and indeed in the 2 days last week, and then Mr. Tyzik and Mr. Buchanan yesterday. And I still have a little bit of confusion, and I want to make sure that it is clear on record what I understand. Let me summarize what I understand, and please respond. And these questions are really directed to Ms. Dansereau, and unless I, throughout my cross-examination, ask for anyone else's response, I will be asking you, Deputy, for your response. Firstly, in respect to the fiscal year we're currently in, 2011 to 12, you have indicated that the reduction in budget is approximately 3%. Is that correct?
3% over the course of the next 4 years is the reduction as a result of the strategic review process. There will be other reductions in future years for other processes as well.
But I thought the strategic review process that you have spoken about that leads to a 5 to 10% reduction triggers off in the beginning of the 2012 fiscal year. Is that not correct?
There are two processes. There was a process started, I guess, 5 years ago now called strategic review, which all departments went through, but in a different way than the current process. And that was a portion of all departments went every year. We, unfortunately, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, were in the last year of that 4-year process. So we underwent strategic review last year, which resulted in us having to start cutting 3% over the next 3 years as a result of strategic review. We are now in the process, as the government announced in the budget last spring, we are preparing proposals for what was then called strategic and operating review. So
yes.
There are two expenditure reduction programs in the federal government, one of which starts being implemented for us in this fiscal year.
And bottom line is, in respect to this fiscal year that we're currently in, your department is facing down a reduction of how much from the previous year in percentage?
I can't remember what the the actual percentages. Maybe David can remember the exact percent, because it's spread over a period of 3 years, and we've been moving the numbers around.
I don't have the calculation of the percent, but the cuts that are starting this year amount to approximately $9 million, and that'll be added to over the course of the next 3 years to achieve a total cut of $56.8 million as a result of the strategic review that starts this fiscal year.
All right, and then we learn as of April 1st of 2012, the continuing reduction in budget leading up to 2015, correct?
Leading up to 3 years after 2012, so yeah, 2015.
Yes, thank you. That being the case, I also learned through Mr. Buchanan's cross-examination with you yesterday, he representing Public Service Alliance, that there is more at play than just these reductions we've talked about, and he referred us all to an exhibit, which was Exhibit 1922, if Mr. Lund can have it up. Mr. Lund could go to page 17 of this document, which shows a graph, and I think we were dealing with it yesterday. Am I correct in saying that this adds a further component in terms of reduction of budget? In other words, before you were through the strategic and operating review analysis that you had to do as part of the deficit reduction plan of the federal government, that you as a department were in fact downsizing your budget for estimates separate and apart from this strategic review process, and that this graph that's now before us indeed speaks to that. Is that not what you were saying to Mr. Buchanan?
Yes and no, and unfortunately it's a complicated system. Yes and no in the sense that these numbers reflect what is approved in the system for future expenditures, and that changes over time because new monies can be added to the budget through the budget process. New monies could be added through renewal of the sunsetting programs, because this would presume that everything that is sunsetting comes to an end. So there are assumptions in here that really show a moment in time and make it hard to do full and final predictions, because the numbers do fluctuate within a certain margin.
But assuming that no new monies are added to the pot, is it correct that you testified yesterday that you are really facing down around an approximately 25% reduction in your budget over these next 3-4 years?
If we look back to 2008, 2009, the numbers are closer to the numbers that we would have now. And in part, the bulge that you saw was the Economic Action Plan, which was 2 years of extra spending, which all departments received in order to address the economic situation that Canada was in. So that makes all departments look like they're receiving a fairly significant cut. But it was only because we were given a fairly significant temporary, very clear that the intent was only ever for it to be a temporary increase.
Okay, whether temporary or not, are we not, as citizens of the country, facing down a reduction from those years 2009-10, 2010-11 to, for the next 4 years, approximately 25% reduction? Isn't that what you said yesterday?
No. Well, I may have, and then I would have misspoken, because we didn't talk about the Economic Action Plan, and the bulge that happened in those 2 years was a temporary and intended to be temporary bulge. So the reduction is, we should remove that bulge of the Economic Action Plan, in which we received, I think, $275 million. I can't remember yeah, 220, but however we define that. And so that money was only ever intended to be temporary and shouldn't be factored into what our general base was.
Well, even removing those bulges, would you not agree with me, between 2008 and what you project for 2012-13, 2013-14, there is a reduction.
There's a small reduction, and that is a natural fluctuation.
And there is that reduction coupled with the reductions that you are forced to make in response to the strategic deficit analysis that you have to do for the Treasury Board, correct?
There will be definitely some reductions. We don't know what they are yet, and we don't know what they mean. We're working through. Our intent, obviously, is to minimize any impacts to Canadians and to maximize our efficiencies. We really will be looking for more efficient ways of doing the same amount and the same quality of work.
And you would agree with me further, would you not, that embedded within your fiscal responsibilities for the department is obviously to meet the terms of the collective agreement with the Public Service Alliance year to year?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me further that the Public Service Alliance current collective agreement, which goes from this year, 2011 to 2013, imposes upon your department salary increases of 1.75% for this year, 1.5% next year, and 2% for 2013. That all obviously has to be met within budget.
Yes.
Yes. And that being the case, is it not correct, as Dr. Riddle has testified at this inquiry, that when one looks at the budgetary when one looks at the reduction in budget that you are facing into the future, one has to recognize that most of the pain and suffering will be suffered by the operational side of your department, because salaries are obviously contractually causing you to be bound by their terms.
I'm not sure I understand the link between, and I wouldn't necessarily call it pain and suffering. Obviously, we're working. We have, as you know, we are at a point in our history where we have a significant a number of retirements coming up, and so we're working through attrition and through other means to make sure that the services that we need to provide Canadians continue to be met, even though we're facing some economic pressures.
Appreciate that, but other than full-time equivalent analysis that you can do to reduce your staffing, all the money obviously must come from the operational side, because those that are still within your staff are obviously protected by the collective agreement.
The salary amount is, there's a cap that was put. We simply were not given the increases as we might otherwise have been in the past. But it's left to us to manage and to move the budgets around in the way that best suit for providing the programming. So I'm not sure what you mean by it's the operational side that will suffer.
What I mean is that obviously there are components of your budget where you lack any flexibility, and that's because of collective agreement provisions, obviously.
That would be the entire budget, I would say, in the sense that the collective agreement establishes the rates that people are paid when we were not given those increases in our yearly budget, and so it's left up to us to manage that and make sure that we continue to provide the services.
Yeah, but the point is that salaries, whether under collective agreement or otherwise, you have less flexibility than you do in trying to meet these reductions by cutting back in your operational side. You're not prepared to admit that?
No, because I'm not. I guess maybe we're having a difficulty in the words. So maybe.
Mr. Bevan?
Yeah.
I think if I understand the questioning correctly, your concern is that because our contracts are increasing salaries, we're going to take it out of our operating budget that pays the bills or gas, etc. And that would be the case if we weren't going to manage it properly, but that's not what we're going to do. We're going to manage it properly, and that means we'll use attrition to keep the balance between our salary obligations and our operating flexibility such that we get the best use out of our staff. It's no good having a bunch of people paid a salary but not having operating money to go out into the field. So that's not what we're going to do. We are going to keep the balance between salaries and operating monies in equilibrium in out years.
Thank you. If I had more time, I'd lead you to Dr. Riddle's evidence on this very question, but that's got to be left for my final submission. Again, still on fiscal, is it not correct that certain programs that have currently been functioning, and I speak of the test fishery, I'm speaking of the not only the test fishery, well, the test fishery was financed by LaRock money, which is sunsetted in April of 12. Is that not correct?
Yes.
And then the ITQ program has been funded over recent time by the pig fee money. Is that not correct?
Partially, yes.
Yes.
Yes. And that too is sunsetted as of April 1st of next year, correct?
That's true.
Have any DFO salaries also been paid out of the PIC fee money?
Yes, there have been salaries, term salaries or non-permanent salaries paid out of that money.
All right. Now, that money being sunsetted in April of next year, where does that put us in terms of funding those two programs and other programs that you've been, where you've been using that pot?
Well, as we've said, we are currently evaluating those programs, and we haven't decided yet because the evaluation is not complete. If, in fact, all of the elements of the program should be renewed, and if they should be renewed, then we will do our best to ensure that there are funds available to renew them. But we are in a fiscally tight environment, and we don't know yet what the answer to that question is because we're not through the process yet.
Oh, Ms. Dansereau, not willing to at least say here that test fisheries are a primary in-season management tool?
I can say, certainly because of the advice that I've been given, that test fisheries are very important to the work that we do, yes.
But you're not prepared to indicate, or you're not in a position to indicate what happens to these programs that are sunsetted at this moment in time as of April of next year?
No, I'm not, because we don't have the answers yet, so I can't invent an answer. We will, as the evidence comes forward to tell us whether or not these truly are high priority. At that point, we start developing plans to either find alternative sources within the department and receive approval to fund them through that, or to go back and seek extra funds to continue them.
When we all met together in November of last year, I had an exchange with you, Ms. Dansereau, in course of cross-examination. And I would like Mr. Lunn to please bring up transcript for November the 2nd of last year and to go to page 63. And there was an exchange, and I want to read it to you, and then I have a few questions to ask. Can I assume, Ms. Dansereau, that throughout the life of this inquiry, you've got a lot of things to do on your plate in Ottawa, but you have been receiving briefings as to the nature of the evidence that has been tendered at this inquiry?
Yes.
And that being the case, I want to draw to your attention the exchange that takes place at page 20 of that page, wherein I said the following, I asked the following: well, this is an awfully general question to you, Ms. Dansereau, but would you agree with me, or let me ask you this, are all science programs, departments, projects, stock assessment, stream enumerations, etc., adequately funded up till now, in your opinion, during the time of your tenure? And you said, answer, I would say yes, but it. And then you went on to say, others will have other perceptions. Nobody's ever happy with the money, and I'm just basically summarizing your testimony. But you said yes to that. Having been briefed on the evidence that has been tendered at this inquiry throughout the past 10 months, are you still standing before us to say that you believe that your programs have been adequately funded?
I'm in a bit of a difficult, position because we weren't able to keep the, we don't have any way to read what you've just read to us, so I'm going to have to go from memory in terms of the list of things that you've just stated. I do believe that based on the advice that I get from our scientists, we are adequately funded. Now, as I've said, and I said last year, there's always room to do more, and there will always be room to do more. So would we accept more money? Yes, of course we would. Could we do more science with it? Yes, we could. But for the moment, I would say we are sufficiently funded.
Okay, and I'm going to lead you through evidence that has been given at this inquiry in the very brief time I have, to ask or invite you to respond to whether or not the people that have testified here, their opinion or their perception should be accepted as being a valuable evidentiary base for this commissioner when he writes his report. Firstly, I want to lead you to Dr. Riddle's response to the very quote I have just read into the record of our exchange back in November.
Mr. Resolute,
February
I'm having
10th.
trouble finding the first reference you gave me. I never found it.
Oh.
So that would be of assistance if we could just.
If you want, Ms. Dansero, I'm happy to show you the exchange that I just read, but if it's not necessary.
No, I just see Mr. Taylor has risen to your left. And
The evidence, firstly, the evidence was on the screen briefly, but then disappeared again.
Okay.
Secondly, I'm objecting in advance. Mr. Rosenblum says he's going to ask a question, which, as I heard him, was effectively, Deputy Minister, will you please consider the evidence I'm going to put to you and tell me if you think that the evidence is good and the Commissioner should accept it as whatever it is. Well, that's for you, Mr. Commissioner, to make those kind of decisions. Partly it's a matter of how he frames the question, which is why I rise now. I think Mr. Rosenblum can ask for comment is what he can do.
I'm happy to ask for comment. If I may go, Mr. Lund, to February the 10th, page 42. I put that exchange that I just read out to you, Ms. Dansero, about your feelings of whether things have been adequately funded. And then at line 40, line 34, I asked Dr. Riddle, maybe start with you, Dr. Riddle. This appears to be the thinking of the senior people within DFO in the context of facing down a 5% reduction in the upcoming year, and obviously having experienced previous reductions as you spoke about them. What is your response to the mindset of the senior people within DFO that they believe that the budget, as currently before them and currently about to be cut, is adequate to meet the very critical matters that have been previously testified to in terms of research? Dr. Riddle responded, well, thank you for that loaded question. Well, I don't think there's any question that I disagree. I am not surprised at all at her reply because, of course, these people are under significant pressure for national priorities, and I'm sure there's a very substantial debate in Ottawa where the money goes to the various departments. But I don't think there's any question that you would get a very common response on the West Coast with respect to salmon stock assessment. I've said publicly here, and I believe that it's definitely at the marginal, responsible level, that sort of what we would define as a core stock assessment responsibility is barely being met now, unquote. Your response, Deputy. Dr. Riddle, you'd have a lot of respect for, wouldn't you?
I have not actually worked with Dr. Riddle personally, but I have respect for all of our scientists and all the scientists, so that's his opinion.
All right.
And he has a right to his opinion,
No.
and
And you
I
disagree
assume
with
that that's his opinion.
Right.
I'm not disagreeing with his opinion, it's his opinion. I'm not, so he can say what he wants. He's right when he says that there are many other pressures, and we do what we can with what we have.
I want to discuss with you the impacts that you face down in respect to the financial situation that we discussed at the beginning of my cross-examination. I want to start with the wild salmon policy. We all know that it was imposed upon your department with the restriction that it would be implemented with the existing funds, and that's embedded within the policy itself. I've heard you testify, and Ms. Farlinger also testified the last few days, that the essence of this document is being implemented, if I understood it correctly. And then you basically said that there were pockets of insufficient knowledge and in the context of the implementation of the WSP. Did I understand you correctly?
Certainly that's my understanding of the situation, yes.
Yes. So, as I understand that turn of phrase, pockets of insufficient information, you're suggesting, are you, that for the most part, the WSP has been implemented, that you know much of what you were expected to know 5 years into the implementation of the WSP? Is that the way I'm to interpret the word, that only pockets of insufficient information remain?
I think, well, hopefully the way my words are interpreted is that the WSP informs the way we make decisions. And as you've heard all of us say, I think over the past 3 days, as information becomes available, we can, first of all, we continue to look for the appropriate level of information, and as it becomes available, we have an appropriate framework within which we can use it to make decisions. So that's what I mean by it's being implemented. It's not sitting on a shelf waiting for all of the information to be gathered before we change our approach, and before we, or at least finalize our approach, and before we work in an integrated way. And so it's a live document is what I'm saying, is that it's useful to us, it's being, we're continuing to use it as a basis for research, and we're continuing to use it as a basis for decision making. But others, it would be better also if others who are actually using the document, my relationship with the WSP is that when the fish plans come forward for the minister's decisions, I make sure that what we have said in the WSP is actually reflected in the plans as they come forward to the minister.
Yeah.
But others can give you much more information.
I'm going to suggest to you that, in fact, the WSP has only been implemented in the most piecemeal form and in a most limited form up to this moment in time. Do you agree with that?
I think what I would say is we have moved ahead on some of the specific actions in the WSP. We have learned that the science will not come to us and be complete. It's not an off-the-shelf product that we'll get within the originally envisioned time frame. That there will be continued uncertainty, and that the WSP allows us some way to apply the precautionary principle to the management of Pacific salmon. And so is every step on the in the framework that is set out in the wild salmon policy taken? Do we have all the information for each conservation unit? Do we even know what the total number of conservation units are? Do we have all the other things that are set out in those steps? No, but we are on the road to dedicating we are dedicating our resources to provide that information, albeit at a much slower pace. But the bottom line is we will never know it all as is envisioned by the policy, and we have to make those decisions in the face of continuing uncertainty. And in continuing uncertainty, we continue to exercise the precautionary approach as set out in the policy.
You say you're on the road, and you also say you'll never know it all, and no one would disagree with either of that. But I'm going to suggest to you, you're right at the start line. You, in fact, know very, very little in terms of, at the CU level, in respect to the Fraser watershed. Is that not fair to say at this point in time? Not to be critical, but it is reality, isn't it?
I'm going to ask Laura to say more about the science we know about. We certainly do know a lot about the stocks or conservation units, and how we define them and describe them continues to be an evolving science in the Fraser watershed. We know a great deal about them, and what it is translating it into the terms set out in the wild salmon policy around limit reference points, and how we make management decisions or provide advice for management decisions around those reference points. So I think we know a great deal about salmon stocks, and I think in the last 10 months you've heard some of the things that we do know. But perhaps Laura can tell us more definitively about the science aspect.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the paper of Sue Grant that we've already discussed and had into evidence goes a long way into addressing some of the fundamental pieces of the wild salmon policy in Strategy 1. And so I think we have, in fact, made a lot of progress within that paper. There are a lot of details about exactly the status and description of the data availability, and discussion around around reference points for each of the
Dr.
CUs.
Richard, I hate to interrupt, but I appreciate that, and that document is before this tribunal, and so it is a matter of record, and I very much appreciate you drawing that to our attention. But let me be more direct in terms of the implementation of the WSP. There's evidence before this tribunal, before this commission, that there's never been an implementation plan for the WSP. You don't deny that, do you?
There certainly was an implementation plan at the start that specifically focused on the production of the science elements, and as we've pointed out, those deadlines were somewhat naive, but as Laura's just pointed out, limit reference points for major stocks like Skeena and Fraser sockeye are on the current timetable. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
The commissioner in the hearing on September 23rd, which would have been Friday, had an exchange with you and asked a question about whether it was realistic that, in fact, his question in part read, and I'm at page 81 of the transcript of the 23rd of September, line 47, right at the bottom of the page. The commissioner asked, now, have you got it? I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Right at the bottom of the page, Commissioner asked, now that we're in 2011, we have about 6 years under our belt. First of all, how realistic is that statement that implementation must be accomplished within DFO's existing resource capability? And then the Commissioner went on with his question, and you, Ms. Farlinger, were blunt and honest by saying you felt that they were naive, your department was naive in thinking that you could really pull this off within a short time frame, and I respect your bluntness about that. However, my question to you is, you did not really answer a secondary question that flows from the Commissioner's question, which is, do you continue to be naive in believing without resources, financial resources being provided to you by budget, that indeed you will be able to pull implementation off within any foreseeable future time period?
I think my answer to that is based on some of the things we've learned overall and specifically in the 5 years around the wild salmon policy, which is it will take us a very long time to collect all of the information envisioned under the wild salmon policy. And I think that it would be very difficult to put a date or a time, or in fact any kind of endpoint on the gathering of even the first tranche of that information. I think what we have learned, and quite frankly we knew this before, we're managing a very complex resource in the face of uncertainty. And so we need to take what it is we know, to put it in a policy context in which I would call the wild salmon policy, and therefore use that framework to make the decisions that we can, recognizing, as I think you may be pointing out, that we're dealing with systems and stocks and resources in which there's a great deal of uncertainty. And with that uncertainty, therefore, there is a policy that says we will measure the ability to harvest from abundant stocks while balancing that against the protection of weaker, less productive stocks. So I think that is realistic. The collection of the data envisioned in the policy, I think, will take a much longer time than any of us envisioned.
Yes, and you have been asked repeatedly in your appearances before this commission about whether there'll be a full implementation, or at least a significant implementation within 2 years. You've been asked even 5 years, and you haven't been prepared to give your prognosis, and I assume you're not today, obviously, for the very reasons you just gave, correct?
That's true with respect to the steps and the data that's envisioned in the very detailed parts of the policy. And I think I explained yesterday and have several times that I think the implementation of the policy and the precautionary approach, which is modern fisheries management and modern science, is something that we are implementing. So it's very much, whether you're talking about the details of will we have piece of data X, Y, or Z, or are we implementing the policy which says we are going to protect weak stocks while providing harvest for more productive stocks, and what is the best way in which we can do that?
Isn't it naive to anticipate even a significant implementation of this program in 10 years without funding? Don't you continue in your state of naivety that you spoke about in response to the Commissioner's question?
We spend at least 64 million was the last estimate for the last year, dollars a year in the people who are dedicated, people and operating dollars that are dedicated specifically to the management of Pacific salmon. And somewhere between 18 and 20 or 23 of that for Fraser sockeye salmon. How you use that money and the decisions you make with it and the data you collect to support it is a powerful tool in implementing that. So it's not nothing. It is taking a look at continual improvement, adding data and information in as we get it, and making decisions that are consistent with that policy. Can we collect the information that is envisioned in strategies 1 to 3 in that policy? I can't put a timeline on that.
Thank you. Now, I spoke about the lack of implementation plan. I'm going to suggest to you that there's also evidence before this Commission, and I can cite the evidence and get it on the screen if you want to challenge me in the slightest about it, but there's been no costing out of the implementation of the plan. You agree with that? Just a yes or no?
Yes, there has been.
Yes, there what?
Yes. Yes, there has been costing out.
I see. And even though Mr. Sprout in December the 9th said to the best of his knowledge there hasn't been costing out, you're saying there has been costing out?
There have been costing out of particular elements of the plan in each year in terms of the work that we've done to move the plan forward. So there has been work planning, there have been costs assigned to the activities within those work plans, and there have been expenditures against that work plan. I would agree with you that there, and I am assuming that Mr. Sprout's comments were related to that. For the costs of the entire implementation in all its details of the wild salmon policy, no, there has not been a plan for that.
I'm sorry, and you would agree with Mr. Sprout that in respect to the comprehensive cost analysis, that has not been done. Is that correct?
I agree with that.
Thank you. Then Mr. Rosenberger has said that from his perception, that the department needs more resources to implement faster, and obviously you would agree with that, financial resources.
Financial resources are always helpful, but as you've heard, many of the problems go well beyond financial issues and go into social and economic issues. And so I would not argue that financial issues or financial resources of and by themselves would move the policy forward. Financial resources would help to collect some of that detailed information, but then the question is how much of the uncertainty does that reduce, and how many more of the social and economic issues that are raised by the policy will be dealt with by it. So while money always helps, the question is it's not just a money problem.
The fact is, going on with a checklist of what has been accomplished within the WSP implementation, we have evidence before this tribunal there has not been one habitat status report completed, certainly for the Fraser, and there's a suggestion that somewhere outside of the Fraser watershed there's work being done on a habitat status report. You would agree that that is, to the best of your knowledge, accurate information before this inquiry?
I had understood that there was a habitat status report for the Harrison stock, I think, but I do agree with your general premise that there are very few of the habitat status reports that have been completed. And I think although we have completed a framework for those status reports for habitat, the focus of our efforts has been around the definition of conservation units and limit reference points.
And do you not agree with me, Ms. Farlinger, that the habitat component of WSP is a critical component that makes part of the entire program functional? Do you not agree with that?
I certainly think that the management of habitat for Pacific salmon or sockeye, Fraser sockeye here, is a critical component managing that stock, yeah.
Mr. Lunn, if you would go to page 20 under Strategy 2, Assessment of Habitat Status. The reading from Strategy 2 at the top of the left side column, the maintenance of sound, productive salmon habitat in both freshwater and the marine environment depends on good scientific information, timely measures to prevent habitat disruption, and compliance with regulatory directives. Habitat management protection require identification of the habitats necessary for the conservation of wild salmon and assessment of changes in their status over time. Then below the photograph at the bottom of the column, an overview of important habitat and habitat issues within CUs will be developed, and habitat status will be assessed using indicators that combine scientific and local knowledge and recognize sensitive life stages and habitats. Ms. Farlinger, you haven't done any of that, have you?
I wouldn't say we haven't done any of that. I would say that we've developed the framework. I would say that this has the work has been focused on Strategy 1, and as several people have said several times, the challenges in and the timetable set out in the original policy was ambitious at best. I think that the part of the other work we're doing in the department, which is the review of the habitat program itself and how it is implemented, and the habitat policy, is very much taking into consideration the things that are the details that are set out in the wild salmon policy, and thinking about how we can implement them. And I think there is a recognition that the kind of things we set out here really was not the way, or is not the way, we discharge the habitat program today on a project by project basis. And so that work is underway. Do we have these habitat indicators? We have them in a variety of situations. They're certainly not gathered together and set out as envisioned in the habitat in Strategy 2 of the habitat policy.
It's not what one would have expected in the way of implementation when the stakeholders bought into this program, but 6 years ago. Is that not fair to say? There are no habitat status reports.
I think there are some, but they are relatively few. Yes.
I want to go to CMP for a few minutes. We've all heard the evidence of Mr. Nelson, and it's been the subject of some of the cross-examination by Commission counsel to this inquiry. And basically, Mr. Nelson said in part, and Mr. Lunn, if you can go to April the 8th of this year, 2011, page 58, he said in part about lines 5, I'll call news connects in terms, I'm just reading from the middle of a quote, that line 7, that unless there is an infusion of capital into the department for purposes of discharging your statutory responsibilities, we aren't going very far in terms of improving the situation. This is my cross-examination, my question to him. He answered, I would say that's a fair statement. Now, having said that, and then there was also evidence by Mr. Steele, who holds a senior position at National Office of DFO, is that correct?
He did.
Yes, and he spoke of budgetary restrictions impairing the effectiveness of monitoring and enforcement, and I can lead you to that evidence, but I'm not going to really have the time. My question to you, Mr. Bevan, because you're the one that spoke to this in your evidence, is you say there's going to be a new day, and that maybe Mr. Nelson wasn't aware of what is your department's future direction in doing this more effectively. Is that a fair summary of your evidence?
I would say that what Mr. Nelson's basing his comments on is the same methodologies that have been employed for some time, looking at the same kind of approaches, And also, I would also indicate that he's had some comments relevant to his understanding of what's going to happen with Pickvey and Larocque, and there's no absolute conclusion that those are going to in fact sunset. They are going to sunset, but whether we renew them has not yet been finalized. So his comments are based on a context, and I think what we need to do is not have CMP work in isolation. They've got to work within the broader context in an integrated way and draw upon realizing the outcomes that they're looking for through working collaboratively with the other elements in the department.
But
If you want to do it the same old way in isolation, you need to have people on the ground. And I said that, but I'm also saying it's the obligation of the management in CMP to look at how they work within the context of the department and how they can work collaboratively within that context to get the information they need to do their job better.
Thank you. Are you aware that Mr. Nelson testified that over $1 million in fines that were imposed by violations section 35 and 36 of the Fisheries Act have not been collected, and in part because they didn't have the resources to do it?
That's not his responsibility to get those. It's not the responsibility of CMP to obtain or to get those fines. That's the responsibility of the of another portion of the operation. Therefore, giving him money to collect fines is not doesn't make a lot of sense.
But you acknowledge that there are over $1 million in outstanding fines that never got collected?
That would appear to be the evidence, yes.
Yes. We come to evidence that was given before this tribunal that organized crime has been involved in the illegal fishery in British Columbia. Are you familiar with the fact this evidence was given at this tribunal?
I'm familiar with the fact that evidence was given, but again, dealing with organized crime and that kind of activity, insofar as it is partly to do with fish, yes, that's the responsibility of conservation and protection, and we do have a major investigations unit or role in that regard. But if it's the allegations we're talking about fish and drugs, and that is a police matter, not a CMP matter when it gets into criminal code infractions relevant to organized crime.
And Mr. Bevan, in the context of fiscal financial budget deficits or budget reductions, are you in a position to inform the public of Canada that your new CNP initiatives will be effective in speaking to this form of criminality?
That form of criminality, again, the accusations were that there was more than just a fish issue to it, that it was in fact criminal code, and our people are not peace officers under the criminal code. They are peace officers under the Fisheries Act, and their enforcement has to be restricted to that area. If they had evidence of organized crime, then I would expect that their responsibility is to take that to the RCMP and appropriate policing authorities.
Thank you. Would you agree with me that in terms again of the checklist of what has been accomplished, what hasn't, that not one CU has yet been taken as a pilot program from Strategy 1 through to Strategy 5? There's evidence to that effect. Do you agree with that? Just yes or no?
Excuse me, in terms of the annual fishing plan, I would argue that the wild salmon policy has in fact been taken through to Strategy 5 based on the information that was available at the time.
Which CU? Name the CU, please.
The Cultus River CU, the Kitwanga River and Wildstock CUs on the Skeena River. There's a variety of, the early Stewart stock. Excuse me for a moment.
And you're saying all 5 strategies were implemented?
I'm saying that the intention of the wild salmon policy was incorporated into the management decisions based on the information that was available for each of those strategies. In some of those strategies, there wasn't much information available.
Right. And then we come to Nursery Lake assessment. Mr. Whitehorse testifies at this proceeding that program has tailed off since the early 1990s, that only 3 lakes have any form of nursery lake assessment. You don't dispute his evidence, do you?
I think you're talking about Mr. Whitehouse.
Yes, White House, I'm sorry, yes.
Yes, I agree that we have somewhat limited information on the nursery lakes.
Thank you. I come to the telemetry work. Evidence has been given before this tribunal that the work is now unfunded. You agree with that? I'm speaking of for the Fraser River.
Okay, I'm not specifically sure which project you're referring to, and some of this work was not, in fact, funded through Fisheries Notions. Quite a lot of the work was, in fact, funded through university sources, National NSERC, National Science and Engineering Research Council.
Are you aware that are you aware whether Carl English's telemetry work is terminated because it's unfunded?
I'm not aware of the specifics. I mean, he is would be working under a contract, and I know that we have done some of that work at some times to address certain specifics, but it was always under, not intended as a long-term monitoring program. It would have been intended, as Mr. Commissioner, as a shorter-term research project.
Thank you. I come to selective fishing. Evidence before this tribunal that the program that DFO had to promote a selective fishing program was stalled after 2003 because CFAR funding ended. Do you agree with that?
The funding under CFAR was intended to be for 5 years and to be transformational to provide the industry and others, in fact, who harvest salmon, to test out methods of selectivity. But as I've commented on earlier, we continue to implement opportunities for selective fishing and implement that actually in a practical way, although there is not additional funding to do it. And this harkens back to the idea of whether we can move in the direction of the policy using the funds, the people, and the regulatory responsibilities we have, as opposed to additional money to give people an opportunity to be funded to do something different.
And you would acknowledge that he would be very knowledgeable about the state of progress in terms of implementing selective fishing programs of DFO? You'd be comfortable relying on his opinions, wouldn't you?
I know that Dr. Hargraves was very involved during the period of the CFAR program in projects to look at opportunities for selective fishing. He has not necessarily been involved in the day-to-day management and the practical implementation, for example, of demonstration fisheries and other things since that time.
With stock assessment, another area or another component of your responsibility, Dr. Riddle has testified that even when he was division manager of science, it was already at a marginal level. He then testified about budget cuts and the implications of budget cuts. Would you agree that it is at a critical state in terms of the lack of funding for proper stock assessment?
Stock assessment continues to evolve. We moved in 15 years ago, and Laura may be able to provide some more specific evidence on this, to looking at key stocks rather than the kind of monitoring that had people on the ground monitoring each and every stock. We use information that's gathered by stewards. Kerry Holt's recent paper takes a look at how do we set standards for people who do not work for DFO to gather information for us. So my point here is we are continually refining how it is we assess the status of salmon stocks, both in season, in the fisheries with DNA, in the mission test fisheries and up the river, and as well as just how much we do to get the best possible estimates. There are, if we currently have about 160 or so, and it ranges from year to year, 160 to 180 people who do nothing but count fish in season. They count them in the fisheries, they count them at the mission operation, and they count them in the streams. So the real question is how can you do this in the best possible way? And I would argue that we make continual changes in the way we assess salmon in order to make the best use of the people we have. And do we need 2,000 people to do that? I don't know the answer
Right.
to that question.
In respect to the consultation side of your responsibilities, Mr. Sato testified here of diminished resources for consultation. Yes or no, you agree with that?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think we have continued to put considerable resources,
Okay.
including half of our staff time,
Fair enough.
resource manager time to
I'll
consult.
put his evidence before the tribunal. Final submission, genomic signature research. Dr. Hinch testified of seeing a deterioration of funding in that area. Do you agree?
Again, some of that funding was not funding that was directly given to the department. I think we have continued to fund the areas that we think are the highest priority.
Dr. Christy Miller testified here and said her funding had run out or was running out and didn't know that she would be receiving more money. Is that still an accurate situation in terms of her work?
Well, before we ask for agreement on evidence, that's not quite the evidence. It might be better to put that proposition, but I don't recall that as, in fact, I know that's not exactly what Dr. Miller said.
Well, that is my memory what she said, but in any event, Dr. Miller testified about a funding problem. I distinctly remember even my cross-examination, but without getting in a slug match with my friend about it, is Dr. Miller's funding secure for the next year or two?
We have provided Dr. Miller the funding that she needs to do her highest priority work.
So you are committed to giving her funds for the next couple of years for her continuing work?
Well, I can't speak beyond the current fiscal year because we don't have budgets for the next year at this point. But we recognize that the work she's doing is very critical, and we have done the utmost to ensure that she has the funds that she needs to continue that high priority work.
I've got 3 minutes left. Socioeconomic analysis, you would agree that embodied within the WSP is a responsibility to carry out socioeconomic work. We have had a lot of evidence given that that work isn't being done and isn't being done in the course of your partial implementation of WSP. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't.
Are you suggesting that where you have curtailed harvest in respect to the weak stock issues that you have carried out socioeconomic analysis before making that decision?
In some of those instances, the answer is yes. In the generation of each integrated fishery management plan, including salmon, there is a requirement for us to provide an economic analysis of the fishery. We have done some economic analyses in situations where we have curtailed harvest as it relates to the wild salmon policy. With respect to cultus sockeye, I think the economic analysis was done prior to the decision to curtail that fishery. And David Bevan may know more about that.
Well, I don't really have time for it. I've got about 2 minutes left. All I'm asking is, do you believe that within the body of evidence at this inquiry there is any document showing an socioeconomic analysis of your decisions?
There are documents showing economic analyses, and I don't know whether they're in evidence.
Thank you. Terminal fisheries with socioeconomic analysis. There was an exchange between this panel and some of my colleagues, I think late last week. You have never done a socioeconomic analysis of the direction you're taking towards a greater terminal fishery. Is that not correct? Was that not the evidence?
As far as I know, there is not a socioeconomic analysis of the terminal fisheries currently demonstration fisheries on the Fraser River.
And would you not agree that that one would have expected as a condition precedent before your department made such a critical initiative to move to terminal fishery?
And indeed, that's why those fisheries are demonstration fisheries, because that analysis is not yet done.
Having completed my cross-examination, other than to ask this back to you, Ms. Dancero, I open this cross-examination by asking you if you still stood by the comments that you made in early exchange with me in November of last year. Having heard my review of some of the evidence that we've heard at this inquiry and the Commissioner's going to have to grapple with, are you prepared to now say that, in fact, DFO has not been capable, because of financial reasons or whatever, but it has not had the capacity to truly discharge its statutory responsibilities to the public of Canada?
No, I'm not willing to say that.
Thank you. No further questions.
I'm going to suggest we take the morning adjournment.
Hearing no recess for 15 minutes.